Hello, and welcome to How to Conduct a Successful Data Management Assessment. Our panelists today are Peter Aiken and Melanie Mecca. I'm E. Marie Pope, the moderator. I will do a brief introduction of the panel, and then we'll move right to the discussion. We'll allow 5 minutes at the end of the time to take your questions. I will also monitor the chat for any questions. Peter Aiken is an acknowledged data management authority and associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, president of DAMA International, and associate director of the MIT International Society of Chief Data Officers. His 12 data management books feature theory and practice on many topics, including the first published work on the role of the chief data officer, titled The Case for Data Leadership. His books also cover how to develop a data strategy and how to raise data literacy across the organization and in society. Melanie Mecca, CEO of DataWise, is a certified enterprise data management expert and was the managing author of the Data Management Maturity Model. She has led over 35 data management program assessments and multi-year roadmap engagements. Melanie developed and teaches intensive courses aimed at building data management capabilities and empowering attendees to conduct comprehensive data management assessments. She has recently become Enterprise Data Management Council partner and is adding the DCAM and cloud data management capability frameworks to her client services portfolio. DataWise has also developed a suite of e-learning courses targeted to deliver data management education across an organization, which is offered B2B for broad internal audiences. Welcome. Oh, yes, and then there's the moderator. I'm E. Marie Pope, Senior Data Governance Architect at Sandhill Consultants. I'm a certified Enterprise Data Management Associate and a co-developer of Compass, Sandhill's data governance management system. Marie was a data governance specialist for a $1 billion revenue cycle project for a US healthcare organization, recently earned the DCAM badge, and has completed 2 DMM assessments for Sandhill, partnering with DataWise, and to great client satisfaction. So welcome, Peter and Melanie.
Be with you, and we should full disclosure say we've all been friends for many years.
So here's the context for our discussion. We all know that data is a valuable asset to be managed, governed, shared, and harnessed for informed decisions and analysis. So where do you start? Enter the Data Management Maturity Assessment, utilizing a reference model measurement framework to evaluate the state of current practices and to empower you for rapid capability enablement. In today's discussion, we'll take up a number of relevant topics to help you decide when to evaluate your capabilities, tips for involving stakeholders, and what to do with the results. Our first question to the panel: how does the organization identify the key drivers for an assessment? What types of use cases are good opportunities to create data value, starting with an assessment? Peter?
Oh, sure. So the real key for this is to identify business problems. The challenge that we've seen over and over again is that organizations will focus on data problems. And of course, data problems cause business problems, but that relationship is never obvious, particularly if you're at the stage of just getting an assessment done and trying to figure out where you are, what sort of place you need to be on in order to start. So that the real key to this is to say, what are the business problems? Because I've found over my 40 years in this business, there isn't a single business problem that doesn't have a data root cause. Melanie?
Yes, I like to say they're chicken and egg, business problems, data problems. Each can cause the other. In fact, for our last assessment, one of the initiatives we recommended was a business process reengineering effort for the handoff between 4 different organizational units who all used Salesforce because there was missing information and things like that. So it's very interesting that business problems and data problems are so linked. But I would say some of the drivers overall for the organization are what are your business aspirations? So if you're a $1 billion company and you want to be a $5 billion company and you have a couple of routes that you think you can go to, start there. If you've had trouble with customer satisfaction, then you're going to concentrate on the customer services areas of your organization. So the drivers can be very unique and different. But I will say a lot of typical use cases are you need to develop or enhance your data management strategy. You need to launch or refresh your governance roadmap. You need to replace or combine your enterprise data warehouse. Let's say you just did an acquisition. So any big data initiative or transformation that you're doing, it's always a good idea to check your capabilities before launching it.
Thank you. So what characteristics should an organization seek in selecting a reference model for use in the assessment?
Go first, Melanie.
Okay. Well,
We'll alternate.
Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of weenie stuff here because I did contribute to the DIMBOK chapter on data management maturity. And in there, we isolated some functional characteristics that a framework should have. So it should be accessible. So it should be written so that both the business, data management professionals, and IT can understand it. It should be comprehensive, covering the topics that you're interested in evaluating. It should be practical. Anything that can't be implemented is useless in a reference model. If it's just theory and nice to have, shouldn't be in there. It should have a progress path built structurally in some way in the model. You should be able to pull it apart. Let's say you just want to examine how you're doing in metadata management. You should be able to pull something out and do that. Should be non-prescriptive and focused on what activities you do and how you support them versus exactly how you should do something. So not solution-oriented is best because everyone is different. Industry agnostic, well-organized so that you can follow the structure and the breakdown. It should allow consistent interpretation, have a reasonable amount of detail, but not too much detail, be technology and vendor neutral, and be independently developed. So if you choose a vendor-oriented model, it might be excellent for the wrapper around the product suite that it addresses, but it might not be sufficiently broad or comprehensive. And also it should have educational support so that people can learn the reference model and how to use it. So that's all in the DIMBOK.
If you didn't get that list, Melanie will be happy to send it to you. She's been thinking about these processes for many years. My approach to this is, I hope, complementary to what Melanie has advocated here, because I agree with everything that she said. But even more important, what I would also suggest is that if somebody tells you they have a proprietary method, you're unlikely to be able to compare your results to somebody else's. So the methods that Melanie and I talk about a lot have a rich 20, in some cases 30-year history of research around this. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a company and somebody will say, hey, look, here's a copy of Melanie's assessment. We're doing Melanie's piece. Right? And I'll look at it and say, no, you're not. Who told you that you were? And they'll say, oh, well, vendor X told me that this was directly derived from what she did. I just don't buy that. I've seen so many challenges around that. And so the idea of having a tradition where we can go along and build on each other's work, I think, is the most important aspect here, because unlike the accounting profession, we've been working on this for probably 250 years, as opposed to accounting that's been around for 8,000 years in order to do this.
And I'll come off mute. So thank you.
Good. Next question, please.
All righty. Is there an available mapping between industry recognized data management reference models? And what if we previously used one framework and then want to employ another one? How do we translate the scores? And is that even important?
Well, let's talk about, first of all, why you would be looking at a maturity model in the first place. And that's the idea that almost all organizations have some form of challenge that they're trying to address. And somebody said maybe data is a problem, or maybe data is a component of the problem that you have. One of the things that we've seen that has been really problematic is people spending lots and lots of money and being told they're terrible. Well, that's generally not a good piece of advice for most businesses. So if you really are terrible, the value of an assessment is going to be different. I shouldn't say terrible. Immature is the proper word for it. So if you're immature in your practices, then you're going to probably look for a different type of an assessment than if you are really up and running and want to fine tune that to get even better. And I know that Melanie will agree with me, and Marie, I know you agree as well, that it's a whole lot more fun to work with a company that's already got something going than it is to continually try to get things started. It's just sort of the nature of things. Melanie?
Well, in terms of getting things started, it helps to have a commitment at the top of the organization. So, and we could talk about that for hours by itself. But anyway, you need some kind of executive advocacy. And in terms of the telling people they're terrible, to use Peter's words, I have worked with organizations all across the spectrum of capability enablement. And I will say that with respect to a reference model, wherever you are, there you are. It's like the Matrix. You take the red pill and you figure it out. And it's quite, using any of the reference models available, it is quite a factual exercise. So, you need to kind of get your skin thick and just go ahead and do it. And you will learn the results, and then you'll have, like ripe fruit, many, many, many actionable improvements can fall out of that. In terms of translating the scores, that's not that easy to do. I've just looked at the DoD reference model yesterday. I first got it, glanced over it, and I was comparing it to the model I know the best, the DMM. And there are some comparisons, and in some cases you can do one-to-one. This summer, on behalf of the Enterprise Data Management Council, I'll be working with Jim Halcomb, head of product development, to refresh and refine the mapping between the DCAM and the DMM for those who use one framework and want to use another one. So, and we'll be as precise as we can so that you can, for those two models anyway, you'll be able to get some kind of score translation. And for the DIMBOK, a long time ago, probably 2013, 2014, yes, the then president of DAMA, who was not Peter, told me that there were probably 85 or 90 different data professionals who had their own scoring mechanism against the DIMBOK. So since the DIMBOK is primarily an excellent compendium of professional knowledge about data management, it was not developed as a measurement instrument. So the ones that are measurement instruments are the ones where you would get a score. One thing about scoring, though, scores are not important. They're just a gauge. So artificial quantification is not what you're after. You're after a qualitative sense of where you are so you can get better.
Melanie, if I can emphasize that point about the scores being less important.
When we do these assessments for various organizations, one of the,
are we at 3.1 or a 3.0, right? And
those little bits of fine-grainedness just are not material. But we see people focusing on the scores. And I agree with Melanie, do not focus on the scores. The real question is, do you have holes? Fix the holes. Once you've got the holes fixed, now we can start building stuff on top of those holes. So it's really, as she said, the qualitative aspects as opposed to the quantitative aspects that are critically important for this. Another part of it too is that while we have a number of different frameworks, and Melanie said there's probably over 100 or so that are out there in terms of this, what it comes down to fundamentally is that there are probably about a dozen or so major areas. And those are the areas that you really need to map in. So if you're going to be looking, for example, at your metadata practices, what you will see is that there are areas within each of the various frameworks for how to measure components of metadata. And you're really looking for, are we at the beginning? Have we gotten up and run? on this? And are we now to the point where we can optimize? And that's a very short description of that process. It's obviously much more detailed than that. But again, 100% I agree, Melanie, that the scores are less important as opposed to what's the general happening, because it doesn't do a whole lot of good. Again, the point I made in the data strategy book, doesn't do a whole lot of good to have great data management practices if you don't know what you're going to focus those resources on. And so what is the business problem that we're trying to address from a data perspective, and how can this assessment help us improve the performance of the organization? I'll add one more piece in here too, and that is we have to keep in mind that while we in the data community are pretty literate around these topics, most of our business counterparts are not. And so we have an education process that always has to occur in this context as well.
Thank you. Yes. Very good points all. Anything to add? I know that people will be very much looking forward to the mapping between these two major reference models. That should be exciting. So once you've selected a reference model, so then the real work begins, right? How do you go about determining the scope of the organization and the data assets that you want to include in the assessment?
Peter?
Oh, this was your turn, I think.
Okay, all right, I'm happy to go. There's many ways to do this. These reference models, let's talk DCAM and DMM because they're similar. They're aimed at the enterprise, so that what the authors of them are looking for is to help organizations with their overall organization-wide data management program. So that would lead to things like a top data executive, a data management organization, operationalized data governance, and would extend eventually across the entire organization. So the scope can be either what the organization considers as critical or enterprise data, highly shared data, or data that is very important for regulatory reporting or key business processes on the one hand. You can also use reference models to dive into the details of one mission area or line of business, and you can look into the details of one domain. So there's a multinational with a China component who is looking primarily at their master data universe. So you can scope it by organizational unit. You can scope it by horizontal shared repository, like a data lake or a data warehouse. You can scope it all the way down to a critical operational data store. So you have to determine what is really most important to you to evaluate.
And I would add on to that as well. And I'm sure both of you have as well, encountered organizations that are really a conglomeration of many organizations.
Right.
I'll just two little stories real quick on that. One of them was a company that we went to, and the organization had been told by Wall Street that they should really be broken up into 4 completely separate companies because they didn't work well as an integrated entity. Trying to do an assessment for that type of a situation was really quite a mess. And it was much better in this case for each of the individual units to have their own their own approach, because, and I don't mean a different assessment. I mean, gosh, not a different method for the assessment, the same assessment, but look at them as 4 different parts of that organization as opposed to coming up with an overall piece. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, in many of the assessments, we use what's called an additive method, and that is really going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you remember the original pyramid around that, if you aren't safe, you'll never be part of something that's bigger than yourself. If you're not part of something bigger than yourself, you don't know yourself. And if you don't know yourself, you'll never get to self-actualization, or what we call flow in the TED Talk world at this point. Those are necessary. And if you haven't achieved those bottom levels, nothing else is good. Or a very simple architectural way to describe it is if the foundation is poor, then the building on top of it, whatever building it is going to be limited by the weakness that exists in the framework. Another way of doing this, though, and this was an actual one that we can talk about, we were working with the U.S. Army on an early effort around this area, and they determined specifically that their business need was making sure that troops were able to deploy faster. So it was a question of how fast can we deploy troops? And by improving the performance. And by doing the assessment in this area, we identified the fact that that was a major limitation. And we were able to affect troop deployment levels in that effort in order to get out as a result of that particular assessment. There was no way we were going to do the entire organization as a part of that. That was way beyond the business scope under these circumstances. So key is, as Melanie said, trying to figure out what is that business problem that you're trying to work on and how can we best support that particular activity.
Okay, then let's talk about the approach or method you recommend for conducting an assessment. What are the considerations to think about?
We both focus a whole lot on observable behaviors and capabilities. If we can observe something, it's got the opportunity to now say it exists, where somebody says, oh, in 2 weeks we'll have this, or in 2 years we'll have that. No, we need to know right now what are those capabilities, because those capabilities are also going to be a limiting factor in your organization. Melanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, well, I've done a lot of assessments. Really, for the past 10 years, it's been a good part of how I spend my professional time. And I'm very fond of the assessment method that was developed along with the development of the DMM, which later became the DCAM as well. And that was a method that tried to get as many of the end customers involved as possible. And why? Because if you're the top data job individual with your organization and you're trying to come up with a robust data management program over a certain time period, you need advocacy, understanding, and buy-in from all of the parts of the organization that are affected by the program. So I love the workshop approach where you have many, many people in a physical or virtual room. They're each representing data knowledge from one area of the organization or the other. And you're looking for consensus on how the organization is doing, but also you're looking for excellent achievements in one part of the organization that are then leverageable to other parts of the organization. So there's a great amount of discovery that happens. And after these workshops, the most common comments that I receive are, it was so valuable to be together and talking about these important issues for the first time. That's the main response. So for that reason, I'm I'm a strong advocate of bringing parts of the organization together. Now, there are survey methods as well. And for certain organizations, if they're very, very capable and they have discrete functions within the data management and governance structures, it's probably acceptable to do that. The first assessment that was ever done for the content model in 2011, I believe, was Citi, and they did it all by survey, 22 different business lines by survey. And they got great results, and they immediately moved forward on improvements. So that's possible too, but I would rather have the consensus. The consensus means that when you come up with the report and recommendations, then you get adoption for them. They're already sort of pre-approved.
You don't have all that
That's
sniping.
what you want. You want the funding to carry the stuff out.
And this is really a key piece to this too. The assessment has to lay the groundwork. One of the things we do when we're talking to organizations is say that you realize you're starting a program. And they kind of go, yeah. And I say, well, do you know what that means? And they say, well, it's something that's going to last longer than a project, right? The real answer is, when are you no longer going to need your data management practice? And the answer is, when you no longer need your HR department. So your HR department, by the way, also has a DMM-like capability model that was done out of the same research stream that Melanie and I are talking about here as well. So it's absolutely crucial to make sure that there is also part of the assessment is the organization's readiness to sustain the effort over a long term. Again, I'll call foul on the Commonwealth of Virginia here, which is where I pay my taxes and get my paycheck from. So if I disappear here in a minute, that's because the governor's after me, right? But we're on our third attempt to go through and start up this assessment process in the Commonwealth. We did some at first. We were sold, I guess, I should be careful because it wasn't really a we, but the Commonwealth was sold what they were told was a data assessment, and it turned out to be actually a survey, which gave you sort of names of systems as opposed to names of data items. So even within the community, there is disagreement about how these things should work. And one of the reasons that Melanie has worked so hard over the years to codify this and to put in place a framework is so that if somebody comes to you and says, I'm going to do this, you have something objective you can compare against and say, well, are you paying attention to these activities? Is this important? Is the literacy of your personnel going to hamper your data efforts, even if you have great data and people are not data literate? It's not going to help.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us back to the topic of education, which the longer I do these evaluations and roadmaps for organizations, the more I realize that if you really want your program.
Oh dear, I hate when that happens. She froze, right, Emery?
Yes, Melanie froze.
Yeah. She'll come back. It's Florida after all.
Hello?
You froze for a quick second. Yeah, you froze for a quick second. So if you could repeat the last one.
I was just going to say the importance of education, the rising tide that lifts all boats. Because eventually, let's say you're an organization of 10,000 people with lots of different data stores and so on. You're going to need several thousand people in one way or another to be involved to help you get these tasks completed, like capturing metadata, like defining business terms, like coming up with quality rules. It won't just be a small group. So it is very good, and your assessment will go much better if everyone is, so to speak, on the same page and they understand the concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So my little plug for education. The longer I go in this field, the more important I think that it is.
And of course, you relate directly to the musical analogy too, which is literally you have to be singing off of the same piece of music if you're going to make good music out of it. And so that's another component. If different parts of the organization believe different. I mean, the hardest people I have ever tried to sell an assessment to are the data science community, because they say, why do I need this? I've got a PhD and 6 years of statistics behind me. What on earth could I need to do this? It's like, if you understand that, that's great. But if your people around you don't understand it, it's going to be a problem. And I'll just, again, another little short story, but it's a data scientist who gets on the elevator with the boss, and the boss looks down and says, Peter, you're doing some data work for me. Can you tell me what's going on? And if I was the naive data scientist, I might turn to the boss and say, hey, I got an 86% result. Well, this actually happened in one instance. And the boss went ballistic, right? Red fire coming out of, we never do anything at this organization less than 100%. Well, it's just a fixed message that got across there. But once again, if we're not on that same sheet of paper, it's going to be a problem.
Yes, absolutely. Context is really important. Yes. Okay. Anything to add, Melanie, or to build? Either one of you? No, we're good. Okay. So how do you decide who in the organization should be involved and in what capacity? And then how do you prepare people in the organization?
Go back to you, Mel.
Okay. Yes. Well, you definitely need an executive sponsor. Why? Because when you bring people together to evaluate where they are against one of these reference models and the best practices contained therein, it is kind of political in that you're pulling organizations together and representatives of those organizations. So it needs to be authorized at a high level of the organization. So definitely an executive sponsor. And then in the method that I follow, you want to identify data subject matter experts from, let's say, different mission or business lines to be participating in the workshops. And also enterprise focus components. For example, if you have a business architecture function, someone from there. If you have internal audit, someone from there, etc. Enterprise architecture, someone from there. So bring those parties together. So they would typically be senior people who would be either directors or managers or have a lot of time in grade and are data domain experts in one way or another, have a lot to add to the discussion. And then I like to do supplementary interviews of senior staff, all the way up to the CFO, COO, CTO, because I'd like to get that enterprise vision to give the context, the business context of all the money they've spent, all that they've done, and all that they want to achieve. So I think that would be the primary roles.
The one thing I would add to what Melanie's already said is keep some time in your schedule, however, to find those surprises. Because every time we have gone into, and I think this is true for all three of us, we have gone into an organization, we've had people that we wanted to speak to, which were perfectly appropriate, but something interesting always comes out of the woods. There's somewhere in the back of the room where somebody's sitting there going, oh, we're going to finally start talking about data. I've been trying to get this going. You're looking for those people because they have stories to tell. And Melanie, I was going to ask you this question when we got to the Q&A, but it's appropriate at this point. You've been doing these assessments now during the pandemic without having to travel and visit. And so you've got a system worked out for that. One of the more valuable things I've always found as I'm doing these assessments is somebody comes to me and says, now we're off the record, right? So, well, you're sort of off the record, but within guidelines, cider house rules, whatever it is that we've agreed to on this. But they close the door and say, now let me tell you something that happened here a couple of years ago where we couldn't sell chocolate, or again, whatever the context is. And I think that's the part that's been very challenging for us to get to at this point. But it is always, at least in my experience, very much of a surprise when these things come in. I never thought somebody in sales was going to actually be really focused on needing a data cube, but it turns out that they understand. They learn pivot tables in Excel, and they want to see it applied to a larger component in here, but they know that nobody else in the organization is capable of even understanding the pivot table aspects of it. Now, that's a very low threshold, so I hope they're not really saying a lot of things around that, but it does happen.
Sometimes in the interviews, you will get some comments that you could sort of vaguely interpret as political, about the organization or complaints or so on. And we tend to work those in diplomatically in the report so that the echo of the problem is contained in one or more sections of the report. So I think that that's true, but mostly if you get people together in a workshop setting as your primary way of getting affirmations or attestations of how the organization is doing, then there haven't been any fights. I've never had a fight. So because, it's all factual, like, do you have a standard, a metadata standard? It's yes, it's no, it's maybe we do, what about this? But it's not fighting words. So it's usually a very flowing.
Objective, clinical.
Yes, objective and flowing, like a graduate seminar.
Yes, and often we find that the project manager or the project sponsor can help bring to the fore some of those people who can add additional insights that maybe we didn't see in the first pass of the people we invited. So, great. So can you assess against parts of a reference model? And what are the pros and cons of that approach? And how do you see the options?
Of course, the real key is that we've talked all along about this holistic approach to data management, that the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And so that is a challenge. It's very difficult, for example, to say, gosh, the tires and the axle in this car are great, but if I haven't got gasoline to power it, it's kind of useless. Again, that's a ill thought through example there. So it is possible, though, and I have been brought in instances where people say, look, we're really just trying to get our metadata practice better. Are there guidelines and things that we can use to understand metadata? Or, as Melanie said, a master data solution in one instance. So it is possible in some cases to do this, but generally it's not recommended because I've never seen a master data project work correctly without also adding in data quality and governance around it. And so those three legs to have a good, well-structured stool, again, to sit on or whatever, to do that, I think is very important as well. Melanie?
I do. However, I have had clients say, we're all perfect in architecture. We don't need any architecture. We need the governance stuff and quality. So many times, I won't say, I always push for what Peter said. It is a holistic program. You want to do a good job with your data across the board, so use the whole thing, use the whole reference model. But occasionally, clients will have reasons why they want to take a chunk. And so I have kind of a loose governance window into the reference models, and I'll offer them that. If they want something that's a little quicker, and focuses primarily on those areas that require a great deal of business engagement. That's an example. So you can. What you miss is the holistic point of view, and you are, there could be better recommendations if you use the whole reference model.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite books is a book called The Goal. And the goal is all about the theory of constraints. And so the key again there is that the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. If you don't understand that these things are in many cases interdependent, you will have a great right hand and a very poor quality left hand of that. There's a good one and there's the bad one, right? Whatever bad is in hands.
Great. So what do you want to see in an assessment report? What should be included? Like, what are the top 3?
I think that you need to have the detail, which you're capturing during the workshops, or which you captured as a result of detailed surveys. So you need to have the detail, and it shows gaps, and it shows things that you can leverage, strengths and accomplishments that they can build on. And it also then would contain the next layer, which would be recommendations to fix gaps, with the norm to the idea of next time getting a higher score against whatever reference model you're using. And then basically, I think that you need to look at the organization. So I always take a look at the themes or factors in an organization that impact on the success of the data management program. One state agency had up to 30% of its key staff retiring in the next 2 years, and they didn't have a lot of documented processes. That deserved highlighting, right? Risk kind of thing. So for negative or positive impacts on the program.
I believe you froze again for a moment, Melanie.
I'll go ahead and jump in while she's recovering. The other 2 things I would include in an assessment report is make absolutely certain.
Program, I do look at.
Sorry, Melanie, you blipped out again. So.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Yes, I was going to say the key to these reports too, and what everybody wants is tell me what to do based on the analysis that you've done and that all of my people have helped you do. So probably the crown of the report is a roadmap of projects, things with beginnings, middle, and end that you can execute over time to bring you rapid progress in your capabilities. So typically we offer like 9 to 12 of the most important initiatives that everything we've learned, what we would do if we were you. And then we pitch that in the briefing to give our point of contact and our sponsor some ammunition with the voice of the customer behind it for why they should fund and do these initiatives. So we try to help the organization with its internal sales for the program and big pieces of the program.
Mm-hmm.
I include 2 additional capabilities. They are part of what Melanie's describing, but I think it's absolutely crucial to double check and make sure they're doing the right things. One is the executive summary, because in the vast majority of the organizations that we work for, the executive summary is the only thing that people will read as a result of the assessment outside of the people who are the data group that are in there. And that executive summary has to be written in English in a way that directly communicates exactly where they are, not sugarcoating it, not saying you're a 3.2 and you can get to a 3.3, but saying this business process that you're trying to support requires high precision automation. And you're only hitting that target 30% of the time, which means you're spending 70% of your time fixing things, doing what Tom Redmond loves to call hidden data factories that are out there. The other thing that should be in that, though, and this gets directly into Melanie's roadmap, is the why. Too often in the data world, we concentrate on the definitions of something. Oh, it's a bed, so we can come up with a definition of a bed as a data element. Well, if you don't understand that the purpose of the bed is also going to be used to track patients across a hospital situation, and by the way, you're going to do this based on room numbers. What room number is the hallway is an interesting question that gets asked a lot of times. Or what room number is the elevator? Yes, hospitals lose patients in elevators on a regular basis for that. And neither of those solutions would have worked under those circumstances given what they were trying to do. So the impact on the business as these things get, because it also gives you a level of standard. It said, okay, if you're producing things and you're getting this much of an error rate, we should see that error rate close and gap, or we should see more conversions. Again, whatever the rationale is, we should see more innovation in the product space if that's what we're trying to move our data in line to be able to do.
Yep. And the initiatives that you write up for the sequence plan and the roadmap need to be like mini business cases. And the arguments for them and the benefits that they would achieve through doing them needs to be grounded in the specifics of that organization. You're you, these are your problems, this is what you want, here's where you are, and therefore, here's what you need to do and why and what it will do for you. So I totally agree with Peter.
And probably most critically around that as well is that when you're starting to put these things out there, what you'll see is that they tie into other things that the organization is doing. So Melanie's already mentioned Salesforce. It's very fine software, but at least 14 times over the past 2 years, I have run into organizations that were doing an assessment. And after they finish the assessment, they say, so I guess we should have cleaned the data before we turned Salesforce on.
Mhm.
Again, to us, this is obvious, but it's not obvious to people on the other end of this. And so Salesforce installed, got it done, boss. It's okay. We can turn it on live. If your assessment says, go ahead, Emery.
Challenge. Well, let me remind you, we have about 4 minutes left. And we can wrap up soon, but I don't see any questions at the moment in the chat. So,
Although, is there a Q&A part we have to look at too?
we were taking Q&A from the chat. So we close at 2:45.
Okay, well then, why don't we take our last question?
Sure. Okay. So let me just ask, among the ones that I've seen, so what do you advise people to watch out for? That's a very broad question, but what do you, in embarking on, what do you advise people to? What are some of the gotchas?
Proprietariness. The idea that we got something secret that you can't have, and none of this stuff is secret. None of it's rocket science, right? It's important. It's critical to work through it in a logical fashion. But the idea that somebody's got something super secret or some magical technology that's going to help you out, it's not there.
Okay.
So I'd say one thing you need to watch out for is fear. A lot of times I've talked to organizations about doing an assessment and they're like, oh my God, I can never get people from group A and group B together. And I say, have courage. It will be okay. We've never had a fight. You will get something out of doing that. So don't worry about bringing the organization together to come up with consensus. It will only help you to get all points of view represented. I would say that. And the other thing I would say on the other end is once you get your results and your initiatives and your remediations and your strengthening suggestions, act on them immediately.
Mm-hmm.
If you let the report sit too long, that can drop all of your progress and momentum. So leap on it, present it to your executives, and try to get funding and go forward.
Yeah, don't wait. So there's a question, Michelle would like to know a little bit more about the DMM model and whether it became more generalized, the new DMM model.
Well, from my point of view, what I know about it is that the ISACA basically has decided it's not in the data management business, but it does have a long-standing CMMI model that's devoted towards product development and software engineering. And it is in the process of taking some of the DMM IP and inserting it into that model to give its appraisers a little more variety on the data side. So it definitely won't be the whole DMM content that's brought in, but that's still underway. So I don't have any knowledge of what the final product will look like.
And I would resist using the term new DMM because there's no there yet.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And thank you so much. That brings us to time. So thank you very much, Peter Aiken and Melanie Mecca. This has been really enlightening about what to look for in a DMM assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of
Thank
fun.
you, Marie. Melanie,
Bye,
always good to
everyone.
talk with you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you to our audience as well. Thank you for your questions and your attention.